This is Star Talk. Neil deGrasse Tyson here, your personal astrophysicist. I got my co-host, Chuck Nice. Chuck.
Hey, Neil.
All right. You know, it's time we do yet another installment. We've done some very interesting installments on COVID.
Yes.
And its progress. And
right.
its and our reactions to it.
Exactly. Like the fact that, it doesn't exist. And we did the show, we did the show about how it was a hoax. And then I think we did and then I think we did that show about how vaccines kill people.
We did the one that with the
microchips. I forgot about that.
The microchips. Yeah.
We did the one about the microchips. I love the 5G show that we did. How?
There could be first-time listeners, Chuck.
I know.
We don't want to mess with their head.
We shouldn't do that.
I think of it as the computers have a cloud that sort of thing.
Right.
There's an academic cloud where in that cloud you reach in, say, oh, there's an academic who's got expertise I want.
Right.
You pull him out of the cloud. Talk to him for a bit and then stick him back in the cloud. That's how I think about this.
Honestly, the way you're describing this makes it sound like you're killing scientists.
No.
No, it's worse.
Not
it's
the
worse.
Spirit energy.
Yeah, it's worse. It's like they're descending from heaven or something.
Well, yes.
Exactly. So we got Nick Christakis. Nick, welcome to Star Talk. And I found you. I was listening to somebody else's podcast, and I said, damn, I want him on my podcast, because I got all selfish about it. So you're a professor up at Yale, and you're a trained sociologist with also extensive medical background. Yeah. And what a perfect combination of pedigree to talk about COVID-19 and societal reactions to it. This is exactly the stuff you think about and care about and do. And your recent book was just released in paperback, Apollo's Arrow. And give me the subtitle on that again.
The profound and enduring impact of coronavirus on the way we live.
Nailed it.
He got it right.
Yeah, there you go. By the way, he wrote this long before we were where we are right now. So when people were saying that this was going to last for 3 weeks, he was writing this book.
Yeah. He's up and saying, no, it's not. I got it right here.
Right here.
Check it out. So Nicholas, just want to say up front that my father was a sociologist, and I have very deep respect for all those who work in that field. And I think they're under-heralded in what role they can play, do play, should play, and what insights they have that the rest of us don't. So I'm delighted to have you on Star Talk. So Nicholas, in your book, Apollo's Arrow, in the preface, you describe the fact that this pandemic and the social reaction to it is playing out as you'd expect. So what does that mean? What did you know that the rest of us didn't? And does that mean we're just the same as every previous pandemic that we read about in the history books? Or did we do a little better?
No, we didn't do any better, unfortunately. You would think that in the 21st century, we would have done better. I think there are two benchmarks you can use. One benchmark is respiratory pandemics. We have records of those going back about 300 years and very detailed records going back 100 years, or more generally, plagues, which have been afflicting human beings for thousands of years. And
so a plague is not just a general term for a really bad epidemic, or does it have specific referencing to like what it does to your skin or other parts or other organs?
Well, plague, I would say, is the broader category to a respiratory pandemic. So there are non-respiratory plagues, right? There are, as you said, afflictions of the skin or afflictions of the gastrointestinal tract, for example, or neurologic plagues like polio, for example, or HIV, is a plague, but it doesn't primarily manifest itself in respiratory, other than pneumocystis pneumonia, in respiratory
And the
conditions.
one thing they all have in common is that they are judgments from God.
Okay.
So some would believe, in fact. But see, here's the interesting thing that you guys are highlighting, which is that this way we've come to live in 2021 and 2020, 2021, now going into 2022, seems so alien and unnatural. But actually, it's neither of those things. Plagues are a part of the human experience. Plagues are in the Bible. They're in Homer's Iliad, one of the canonical works of Western fiction, begins with a plague. They're in Shakespeare. They're in Cervantes. So plagues are not new to the human condition. They're just new to us. We think this is crazy that we have to live in this way and that we're facing this threat. But this threat is an ancient threat that our ancestors confronted. In fact, they were so alarmed and disturbed, our ancestors were, by their experience, that they reduced this experience into our religious traditions, into our literary traditions. They tried to warn us. Our ancestors tried to warn us. They said, there's this thing that happens. It's a plague. It's awful. And let's tell you about it. And we somehow didn't listen to them. We didn't hear it. And many of my Jewish friends, for example, in the spring of 2020, during Passover, they were like, all my life I'd said the Passover Seder, and now suddenly, I really understood what my ancestors were talking about when they talked about a plague. So this is a very, we have written records of plagues going back thousands of years. Many of the things that we are experiencing, I would say almost all of them, frankly, are familiar. Thucydides in the Plague of Athens.
Except for the 5G. Except for the 5G accusations.
Yes, but
I don't know. I've read some things about bubonic where they were like, hey, 5G.
Yes. Well, no, almost, guys. Almost, literally, almost. Okay, so in fact, during the Plague of Justinian 1,500 years ago, I'm pretty sure it was a Plague of Justinian. It was one of the.
Wait. You have plagues You just have plagues memorized. You just plague fluent.
Let me just tell you, I'm
that's
so
sad
impressed.
and beautiful at the same time.
Dr. Christakis has a plague catalog in his head.
There are many plagues. Yes, but no,
Okay.
but the 5G analogy. So one of the things is, so in my lab we study social network.
Let me announce that. Yeah, so you're a director. I'll say it for you. Director of the Human Nature Lab at the Yale Institute for Network Science. So this is where the rubber hits the road. So go on. Yeah.
No, right. Well, we study the mathematical architecture of human social networks, the evolutionary origin of networks. Why do we have friends? Why our human networks have a particular topology, a particular structure? How did natural selection shape that structure? What does it mean for our lives? And how are we equipped to interact and so on? So we study all of these things. And then we study spreading processes on what are called these graphs, these architectures of ties. So we study, for example, how germs spread, or how ideas spread, or how money spreads, or how emotions spread, and how all of these things spread within networks. And what we're talking about now, this is sort of very abstract, but what we're talking about right now is the spread not only of the germ, the coronavirus in our case, but also you highlighted this 5G, conspiracy theory, the misinformation, how it spreads. And one of the things you need to understand about plagues going back thousands of years is that as the germ spreads through this social network, right behind it is lies.
Whoa.
And in fact, this has been observed for thousands of years. So during the Plague of Justinian, I think it was John of Ephesus, who was a historian and a priest at the time and was documenting what was happening. He has this very kind of almost funny passage where he says, the plague was devastating the city, and a rumor went out such that the housewives in the city concluded that if you threw terracotta pots out the second-story window of your house onto the street below and it shattered, this would ward off the plague. And so John of Ephesus writes, he goes, it became more dangerous to walk through the city for fear of being hit by pots than from contracting the plague itself. So these types of superstitions, we saw them, from the White House in the last administration, that if you inject yourself with bleach or irradiate yourself, or charlatans of all kinds appeared out of the woodwork saying, take silver or do this or do that, or all kinds of rumors, as you said, Neil, about 5G, and on about vaccination, about masking, endless lies.
So the actual thing is just a detail. It's the idea that that misinformation follows a social networking pattern, no matter what that misinformation
Except for the bleach. Except for the bleach. The bleach
No.
works. It works.
No,
Very
stop.
good. Very good.
Oh, God, Chuck, stop.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
No, the two general principles, Neil, and one general principle is that you might almost say that the emergence of mendacity is a feature of plagues. that, in other words, even to call something a plague, you might want to go so far as to say, not only do we need a spreading and serious pathogen, not only do we need rising case counts, which, by the way, is the sine qua non of an epidemic, but we also need lies. That's one principle. The second principle is that you can model the spreading dynamics, the ways in which this information spreads on the graph, similarly that you model the spread of germs. That's a second overarching principle. Whoa. But the details are, of course, different, right? Like, what is the rumor? Is it 5G? What is the piece of misinformation? That, of course, varies from plague to plague.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Man, I just want to know, based on what you just said, is any of that, can you measure and quantify it, who does that purposely? Because I'm sure there are opportunists who know that and take advantage of it. You know, you often see demagogues rise at the same time.
That's exactly right. In fact, often serious pandemics lead to great shifts in the political landscape, or are prompted by prior shifts in the political landscape. For example, if there are wars or conflict between states, often you see plagues arise then, and after plagues you can see people, despots and others rise to power, exploiting the suffering of people. But one of the things that's also very interesting, and this borrows on some metaphors from physics, you can think of a social network, which many listeners may
just
have.
To be clear, but we can back up just for a moment. So when you say that a despot would exploit the underclass, or what you mean there, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you've been badly affected by the plague, whatever previous system of governance did not prevent it. So it allows someone else to rise up and claim that they're going to be the one to fix it for you.
Yes, and there's some ideas.
That's how you're taking advantage of this. Is that
yes,
what you
even
mean?
in other words, sometimes it's explicit, like some despot says, "Oh, I'm going to deliberately exploit this." Others, it's not so explicit. It's just a change in social order. So, for example, after the bubonic plague in the 14th century in Europe, and by the way, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, so-called, the Black Death, so-called, which was in 1340s, there were waves of it every few decades for 500 years in Europe, and it decimated the European population. There are many people who have argued correctly, in my view, that kind of death, where, let's say, about 30% of Europeans died, in some cities 50% or 80 or 90% of the residents of a city died, led to a great crisis. So it was very clear the politicians couldn't stop it, so those guys were useless. The priests couldn't stop it, so religion was useless. The doctors and the scientists didn't know what was going on, so they were useless. So many people have argued that it paved the way for the emergence of new democratic institutions politically, new forms of government, new types of science, and the Reformation, that it paved the way for a different attitude towards religion. So all of those things are things that can happen. But if I might, I wanted to go back to what I was going to say on these spreading processes, which was a different aspect of what Chuck asked, which is that social networks, if many people are familiar with these images of networks with dots and lines drawn on a two-dimensional page, this complexity, with this sort of knot in the middle and this kind of feathering towards the edges. But actually, networks are a hyperdimensional surface. And you can think of things spreading in that surface. So, for example, the germ is spreading. You can think of waves of germs in that surface and waves of information in that surface. And you can actually borrow mathematics from physics to look at wave interference. And so the question is, which wave, like, how do they reinforce each other? So a wave of misinformation, you see, can reinforce a wave of the spread of the germ, or vice versa. A wave of the spread of the germ can activate people to seek out accurate information. And you can borrow certain kind of mathematics involving differential equations and other ideas to model these wave interference pattern. And you can actually, and my lab does this kind of work, you can actually get a deeper understanding of how these things interact and the circumstances under which waves of information can retard, waves of correct information can retard the spread of the germ, and waves of misinformation can accelerate the spread of the germ.
Wow. So this is in wave mechanics, if two waves are resonant with peaks and valleys matched up, then they basically double the effect.
Yes.
But they can come out of phase with each other and then cancel.
Yes.
And so you're applying this to social networks. This is great.
So the constructive interference of social networks.
Yes.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So we got to take a break, but when we come back, Nicholas, I'm tired of hearing you tell me what the problem is. I want to know what the solution is, okay? That's why I have you on this show. So
Okay,
when
well,
Star
we'll see.
Talk, we'll see. When Star Talk returns,
No
we've
pressure.
got Professor
No pressure.
Nicholas Christakis talking about the social networks and COVID. We're back, Star Talk. I've got Nicholas Christakis. He's a professor at Yale who thinks about and studies social networks even before such a thing as social networks was a common term, because there have been social networks even before the internet, believe it or not. And so when you've got that kind of insight...
Take that,
you are
millennials.
I know. You've got some deep understanding of what's going on, how, and why. So we left off, Nicholas, with you describing a hyperdimensional coordinate system where information, true or false, moves in this coordinate system and occasionally interferes with other movement of information, canceling it out or magnifying it. And I love that analogy to the physics of wave mechanics. What I want to know is, what good are you to have this analysis if you can't in the next breath say, here's what you do about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, we do a lot of experiments in my lab to try to exploit a deep understanding of human social interactions and of the mathematics and dynamics of human social networks to try to invent things to make the world better. Now, if I might, I'll just digress and just sketch a couple of experiments and then some potential implications with respect to the coronavirus pandemic. So, for example, one of the things we do is we use some software we've developed to map networks in developing world villages, for example, in India, in Uganda, and in Honduras, where we have a big project funded by a number of funders, including the Gates Foundation and the Nomis Foundation. We map the networks of people there using this software. We ask people who are your friends, and we ask everyone else who are their friends. We map these networks. And then we use some mathematical algorithms to identify who in this village, let's say, is structurally influential. Not by virtue of who they are, how rich or poor or tall or short, for example, they are, but rather by virtue of where they are located within the network. For example, if you were a bioterrorist and I asked you, who in New York City would you want to infect to get the biggest epidemic the fastest possible, you might imagine that someone very popular and very well connected in the city would be the person you would infect, rather than someone who has no friends, for example, and just stays alone in their apartment. Oh. But we can use more sophisticated methods than that. And then you can identify people within these villages, and then you can give them an educational intervention, for example, about breastfeeding or vaccinating their children or about proper latrine usage, all these public health things that my lab does.
I got it.
And then what we do is we do these large-scale experiments where we randomly assign out of hundreds of villages, different villages to different targeting algorithms. And then we test which algorithm gives you the biggest informational cascade. Can we create artificial tipping points by thoughtfully targeting a small subset of people such that if we persuade them to change their behavior, everyone copies them? So that's one class of experiment we've done.
That makes complete sense. In retrospect, of course, duh. Yeah.
You just described Fox News.
Well, no, Fox News. Yeah.
No, that's a joke.
That's a different, I know, but that's a different kind of broadcast power. In other words, one of the things about networks you have to understand is that Neil has the same network power that you and I have, Chuck. In other words, when he likes a book, he can tell his friends whether they like a book and will have some influence on them just the way I do. But in addition, he has a
like
kind
Apollo's arrow, for example.
For example, but Neil also, for example, but Neil also has broadcast power, and that's like different than you and me in that is a rain from the heavens. In other words, it's a kind of a different process. It's sort of outside the network system. But okay, so that's one class of experiment. A different class of experiment these online experiments we do, which we've done with tens of thousands of people, where we create temporary artificial societies of real people. We bring in, let's say, 4,000 people, and we put them into 200 groups, and we experimentally manipulate, for example, the structure of the groups, or the income inequality of the groups, or who is given what piece of information, who is told the truth and who is lied to, for instance. And then we let the people interact in that system, and then experimentally test different interventions that might, for example, enhance the cooperation of the system, or decrease the racism, for example, how people treat each other, or how we might optimize the flow of accurate information in the system. So we do all of these experiments. So it's this class of work that we do that sheds some light on some interventions we might deploy with respect to coronavirus. But it is, in fact...
Okay, so I can say in the last two and a half years, you failed.
Yeah. I alone, yes, I have been unable.
It is your fault.
Yes. I mean, yes. It is a difficult problem in our enormous society with our media landscape.
Yes.
To try to tackle the problem of the spread of misinformation, a huge problem. And in some ways, it also reflects some appealing qualities. We have a free and open press. We have freedom of speech in our society. I wouldn't want to live in a society in which some agent, like the government or some other agent, specified who could say what, or what was the truth. But the downside of that is we have to tolerate and willfully counteract the spread of lies. And we haven't had, unfortunately, a tremendous spread of lies. And if I might just go on a little digression, a more sociological digression, this virus, in my judgment, happened to strike us at a particularly vulnerable moment in our life as a society. We have century high levels of economic inequality. We have half-century high levels of political polarization. We have a kind of scientific illiteracy that I know you and others are trying to counteract, that is very high. I mean, very large fractions of Americans believe in that the Earth was created 10,000 years ago, for example, or don't understand basic statistics, even basic ideas. We have as well a kind of suspicion of scientists, like, because there's a very ascendant anti-elitism in our society right now, because of this political and economic polarization, scientists are seen as just another elite, another group of people seeking to exploit us for their own venal interests, which is wrong, of course. Of course, scientists are human, they have their own interests, but that's not, in my judgment, the correct way to see scientists. And finally, we have a loss of capacity for nuance in our society. Right now, everything is black or white. You're with me or you're against me. There's a kind of tribalism and a kind of lack of capacity to see, well, things are complicated. A lot of these topics that, like climate change or pandemics or nuclear power, or all of these things that you talk about, are difficult topics that require a serious conversation. And you know what? The virus struck us right now when we are unable to work together to develop a basis of facts, and then to fight our ideological battles apart from the facts, and then once we fight that battle, reach a consensus as a nation on how to combat the pathogen. So we've died in great numbers, Neil and Chuck. We have died in great numbers.
We're rising through 5 million worldwide, right?
Worldwide, but in the United States, we will lose 1 million Americans. 2 million would have died if we'd done nothing, I believe. But 1 million of our fellow citizens, I think at least, will have died before this pandemic is over, partly for our lack of ability to have a sound, scientifically based, politically organized response.
It's funny, while you were talking there, Nicholas, Chuck was saying, yes. Yeah, it's like in church when you say amen.
Yeah.
Amen. But Chuck's version of that is,
I was
yes,
like this,
yes.
preach, brother, preach. Look at the man, yes. Say it now, say it.
I heard you, Chuck.
Yeah.
Every 30 seconds. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know why? Because listen, I love, and you do this too, Neil, and so I can't do it. And I swear I'm trying, because my exposure, because of Neil, causes people to, ask me stuff, and I'm like, don't ask me that shit. I'm sorry. But what I like about you guys and many scientists is that everything that Dr. Christakis just said, and I've seen this from you too, Neil, is when you're a comedian, that person is just stupid. That's the way you look at them. You're a dumbass, and that's all there is to it. But you guys look at people like, no, that's not the way to look at it. What we have to do is figure out how to get through to that person. What we have to do is figure out how do we inspire that person. And, you know, I admire that and I hate it at the same time.
Well, also, Chuck, I mean, the other thing is it's a fact that, you know, our fates are tied to our fellow citizens. And so we have a selfish interest in trying to get our fellow citizens to behave better. But even if we didn't have a selfish interest, we should have an altruistic interest. I mean, these people who have some of these beliefs in like 5G, for example, deserve our care and our help and our empathy. They are our fellow citizens. I have no interest in, like right now there's a kind of a narrative that's rising, like if you're not vaccinated, you deserve to die. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, that's a little rough.
It's really rough. I don't think
That's
that's true for several reasons. I don't think that's true. First of all, I don't think that's true because I don't want any human being to lose their life needlessly. And second, some of those people have been taken in by a set of false beliefs and have been deluded in a way.
Duped.
Duped. And I feel sorry for them. I mean, anyway, so this is, I think I'm very ashamed of how we've done as a country in terms of combating the plague. I mean, we opened this conversation by talking about how plague is an ancient threat. But the thing that's a little different about us right now, candidly, is we're the richest nation the world has ever seen. We have 200 years of efforts to invent vaccines. Countless scientists, doctors, and patients have labored to produce this knowledge. We have scientific experts. We have virologists, immunologists, epidemiologists, medical historians who could have told you about respiratory pandemics going back 100 years. In fact, one of the reasons I knew this was going to be so serious is that I knew the history of respiratory diseases because other scholars had put them into books. And you could by February of 2020, I knew what was going to happen. You asked me earlier, how did I know? Well, because I read books, and there are other scientists that have spent their lives studying this stuff. So why do we have...
But Nicholas, if you read books, you're missing out on some really good video games.
No, but the point is, this capacity... This capacity. Actually, there are great video games about epidemics too. It turns out. But Neil,
that's good.
But as you guys know, this capacity to the scientific method, which is one of the triumphs of human ingenuity, and this capacity to collect information and transmit it, which, by the way, we spend billions of dollars every year on in our society, in our time of need. When we were being beset by a deadly pathogen, you would think, we would say, aha, we can now take advantage of this and save our lives. And yet a significant fraction of people and a significant will didn't do it. I'll say one more thing. I think the intermediate lethality of this pathogen, it's 10 times deadlier than the flu, but it's not as deadly as smallpox or bubonic plague or cholera, which can kill 30 or 50% of the people they infect. This intermediate lethality harmed us. I think if this plague had been, let's say, much deadlier, and there are coronaviruses which kill 10 or even 30% of the people they infect, I think we would have taken it much more seriously. So this virus was really sneaky. It hit us right, and this capacity of the virus. This virus has this other property, which is really interesting. It has what is called protean manifestations. In other words, the virus causes a great variety of clinical presentations. It can affect your lungs, your gastrointestinal tract, can make you fatigued, and a great variety of severity. So let me give you a thought experiment. Imagine you had 1,000 people, population A has 1,000 people, 10 of them are infected with a virus and become seriously ill, and one of them dies. So 10% case fatality rate. Mm-hmm. Now imagine population B, you have 1,000 people, 10 of them get infected and become seriously ill, and one of them dies just like before. But in addition, 90 people get a mild version of the virus, so 100 total people infected in population B. So 1 out of 100 dies, 1% fatality rate. So if you ask people which of these two worlds would you rather be in, a world in which 10% of the people get infected die, or a world in which 1% of the people that get infected die, many people would wrongly choose world B, where 1% of the infected people die. But that is a delusion. If you stop and think about it, world B is the worst world to be in, because the same number of people get seriously ill, the same number of people died, but in addition, 90 get a mild illness. There's more disutility in world B. World B is a worse world. And this virus,
But not only that, isn't it true? Not only that, isn't it true? Had it been more deadly, then, and we sort of sat to attention sooner, a more deadly virus probably would have ended up with fewer deaths in total.
it could have been if we sat to attention. That's absolutely correct.